the frozen tomb. The cold was the first sensation Ricky felt as he clawed his way back to consciousness. It was a cold so profound that it seeped into his bones, a cold that seemed to originate from the very core of his being. His eyelids, heavy as lead, struggled to open, and when they finally did, the world around him was a blur of dim light and shadow. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, each one a struggle as if his lungs had forgotten how to function. Panic surged through him, but his body was slow to respond. His fingers twitched, then clenched into fists as he fought to regain control over his muscles. Gradually, the fog in his mind began to clear, and the memories of where he was and why he was here came flooding back. He was in a cryo chamber, one of thousands designed to preserve human life through the most extreme of circumstances. He had volunteered for this mission, a mission that had been shrouded in secrecy, even from those who were a part of it. The last thing he remembered was the sterile white room of the cryo facility, the reassuring voice of Dr. Novak, and the sharp sting of the needle that had put him into the long, dreamless sleep. Ricky forced his body to move, to push against the cold and the stiffness that had taken hold after centuries of disuse. His muscles protested with every movement, but he pressed on, willing his limbs to obey. With a monumental effort, he managed to roll onto his side, his eyes scanning the chamber around him. It was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the emergency lights embedded in the walls. The cryo chamber was a small, confined space, lined with rows of pods identical to the one Ricky had just emerged from. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of decay and disuse. Dust coated every surface, and the once gleaming metal walls were now dull and corroded. Ricky's heart pounded in his chest as he realized just how long he must have been asleep. The facility looked as though it had been abandoned for centuries, maybe even millennia. The realization sent a wave of dread washing over him. How long had he been in cryosleep? What had happened to the world outside? With trembling hands, Ricky reached for the control panel on the side of his cryopod. The screen flickered to life, displaying lines of data in a language that was only partially familiar to him. His mind, still sluggish from the effects of the cryosleep, struggled to make sense of the information. The date on the screen caught his eye and his breath hitched in his throat. It was impossible, unbelievable, but there it was in stark black and white. March 15, 5002 AD. He had been asleep for 500,000 years. Ricky's legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto the cold metal floor, his mind reeling. 500,000 years. The world he knew, the people he loved, were all gone. They had been dead for longer than he could even comprehend. The enormity of it was too much to bear, and for a moment he felt as though he was drowning in despair. But Ricky was a survivor, a man who had faced death before and come out the other side. He forced himself to take deep, steadying breaths, to push the panic aside and focus on the here and now. There was no time to dwell on the past. He was alive, and that meant there was still hope. With renewed determination, Ricky struggled to his feet, his legs wobbling beneath him like a newborn foal's. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. He stumbled toward the door at the far end of the chamber, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. The door was sealed shut, but a quick inspection revealed a manual override lever hidden beneath a panel on the wall. Ricky pulled the lever, and with a groan of ancient metal, the door slid open. Beyond it was a narrow corridor, its walls lined with pipes and cables that hummed with a faint, almost imperceptible energy. The air was even colder here, the smell of decay more pronounced. Ricky shivered as he stepped out into the corridor, his breath misting in the frigid air. As he moved forward, the sound of his footsteps echoed off the walls, the only sound in the eerie silence that enveloped the facility. He passed by more cryo chambers, each one identical to his own, each one housing a body frozen in time. Ricky couldn't help but wonder if any of them had survived, if there were others like him somewhere in this vast, silent tomb. At the end of the corridor, Ricky found a stairwell leading upward. The steps were steep, and he had to use the handrail to pull himself up, his legs still weak from disuse. The climb was slow and arduous, every muscle in his body protesting with each step, but he pushed on, driven by the need to understand what had happened to the world he had left behind. When he finally reached the top of the stairs, he found himself in a large open room filled with computer terminals and monitoring equipment. The room was in a state of disrepair, the machines coated in a thick layer of dust, their screens dark and unresponsive. But in the center of the room was something that caught Ricky's eye, a large cylindrical device that hummed with a faint, pulsing energy. It was the AI core, the brain of the entire facility. Ricky approached it cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. If there were any answers to be found, they would be here. He reached out and touched the control panel, his fingers leaving smudges in the dust as he activated the system. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft whir, the AI core came to life, the screens around the room flickering as they booted up. A voice echoed through the chamber, calm and emotionless, yet carrying a weight of authority. "Greetings, Cryo team," the AI intoned. "The date is March 15th, 5002 AD. You have been in cryogenic suspension for approximately 500,000 years." Ricky swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight. Hearing the AI confirm what he already knew did little to lessen the shock. He took a deep breath and forced himself to focus. "AI," Ricky rasped, his voice hoarse from disuse. "What happened? Where is everyone?" There was a brief pause, and for a moment, Ricky thought the AI might not respond. But then the voice returned, colder and more clinical than before. "The Earth suffered a series of catastrophic events approximately 3,000 years after you were placed in cryogenic suspension," the AI explained. "These events led to the near extinction of humanity. The cause of these events is currently unknown. You may be the last living human in existence." The words hit Ricky like a physical blow, and he staggered backward, his mind reeling. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was almost too much to bear. The world he had known was gone, and with it, everything he had ever loved. But there was no time to grieve. Ricky knew that if he was the last human, then it was up to him to find out what had happened, to ensure that humanity's legacy was not lost forever. He needed to survive, and to do that, he needed the AI's help. "What do I need to do?" Ricky asked, his voice trembling with the weight of the responsibility that had just been thrust upon him. "The facility is operating on emergency power," the AI replied. "You must locate and activate the backup generators located in the lower levels of the facility. Once power is restored, I will be able to assist you in locating other cryo facilities and awakening any remaining survivors." Ricky nodded, his resolve hardening. He was alone in a world that had moved on without him, but he would not give up. He would survive, and he would find a way to rebuild what had been lost. With the AI's guidance, Ricky set out to restore the facility's power, his mind racing with the possibilities and dangers that lay ahead. The journey was just beginning, and he knew that the road ahead would be long and treacherous. But he was ready to face whatever challenges awaited him for the sake of humanity. A world transformed. The journey to the lower levels of the facility was harrowing. The stairwells were steep and narrow, and in many places the steps had crumbled away, leaving gaping holes that Ricky had to carefully navigate around. The air grew colder and more stale the deeper he descended, and the faint hum of machinery became louder, a constant reminder of the facility's precarious state. The walls of the stairwell were lined with pipes and cables, many of which were corroded or leaking strange fluids. Ricky could feel the vibrations of the failing systems through the soles of his boots, and the knowledge that the entire facility could collapse at any moment weighed heavily on his mind. When he finally reached the bottom of the stairwell, Ricky found himself in a vast underground chamber filled with rows of massive generators. The machines were ancient, their surfaces covered in rust and grime, but they still hummed with a faint pulsing energy. It was clear that they had been operating on minimal power for centuries, just barely keeping the facility alive. Ricky approached the nearest generator and inspected the control panel. The screen was dark, but the buttons were labeled with symbols that were only partially familiar to him. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but then he remembered the AI's instructions. He needed to activate the backup generators and restore full power to the facility. Taking a deep breath, Ricky began pressing the buttons on the control panel, hoping that his actions would trigger the startup sequence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud groan, the generator shuddered to life, the lights on the control panel flickering as the machine began to power up. Ricky's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the other generators in the chamber come to life one by one, their low hum growing louder and more synchronized. The lights overhead flickered, then brightened, illuminating the chamber in a harsh, sterile glow. The facility was coming back to life, and with it, the hope that Ricky might not be alone after all. "AI!" Ricky called out, his voice echoing in the chamber. "I've restored the power. What's next?" The AI's voice crackled through the facility's speakers, calm and authoritative as always. "Power has been restored to the facility. I will now initiate a scan of the surrounding area for other cryo facilities. This may take some time. In the meantime, I suggest you familiarize yourself with the layout of the facility and prepare for any potential threats." Ricky nodded, though the thought of potential threats sent a chill down his spine. He had no idea what might be waiting for him outside the facility, but he knew that he couldn't afford to let fear paralyze him. He had to be ready for anything. With the AI scanning for other survivors, Ricky set out to explore the facility. The corridors were long and winding, leading to rooms filled with equipment and supplies that had been left to decay over the centuries. Most of the machines were beyond repair, their components corroded and useless, but Ricky managed to salvage a few items that he thought might be useful: a flashlight, a utility knife, and a battered first aid kit. As he explored, Ricky couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The facility was vast and empty, and the silence was oppressive. Every creak of the metal walls, every hiss of escaping steam made him jump. He knew that he was alone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. After hours of exploring, Ricky found himself in a large, open chamber that appeared to be a control center. The walls were lined with monitors and control panels, many of which were still functional thanks to the restored power. In the center of the room was a large, circular table with a holographic display hovering above it. Ricky approached the table and activated the display, which projected a map of the surrounding area. The map was old, the data outdated, but it gave Ricky a sense of the world outside the facility. The land around them was a barren wasteland, with no signs of civilization for miles in any direction. "I have completed the scan," the AI reported. "There are several other cryo facilities within a 100-mile radius of this location. However, the majority of them appear to be offline, with only minimal power remaining. The closest facility with a potential for survivors is approximately 20 miles to the east." Ricky felt a surge of hope at the AI's words. If there were other facilities with potential survivors, then maybe he wasn't as alone as he feared. But the thought of what might have happened to those facilities after 500,000 years made his stomach twist. He knew that the journey to the other facility wouldn't be easy, especially given the condition of the world outside. "What's the status of the environment outside?" Ricky asked, bracing himself for bad news. "The atmosphere is breathable, but the radiation levels are higher than normal," the AI responded. "You will need to take precautions when venturing outside. The temperature is also extremely low, and there is a risk of exposure to hazardous materials. However, there is no immediate threat from any known life forms." Ricky frowned, absorbing the information. The environment sounded harsh, but not unmanageable. Still, he would need to be careful, especially with the high radiation levels. He mentally reviewed the supplies he had gathered and realized he would need more if he was to survive the trek to the other facility. "Is there any way I can access the facility's storage rooms?" Ricky asked, hoping to find more supplies that would help him on his journey. "Access to storage is restricted to authorized personnel," the AI replied. "However, given the circumstances, I will grant you access to the main storage facility. It is located on the lower levels adjacent to the generator room." Ricky nodded, grateful for the AI's assistance. He made his way back down the stairwell, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The facility felt like a tomb, and as he descended deeper into its bowels, the weight of its history pressed down on him. This place had once been a haven, a place where humanity sought refuge from the dangers of the world. Now, it was a relic of a time long gone, filled with the ghosts of the past. When he reached the storage room, Ricky found the door already open, the AI having overridden the security protocols. Inside, the room was filled with rows of shelves, each one stocked with supplies that had been preserved in vacuum-sealed containers. He quickly began to gather what he needed: a radiation suit, thermal clothing, food rations, water purification tablets, and a portable shelter that could be used in case he needed to spend the night outdoors. As he packed the items into a sturdy backpack, Ricky's mind wandered back to the others who had been placed in cryo-sleep. Were any of them still alive? Had they managed to survive in this harsh new world, or had they met the same fate as the rest of humanity? The thought of being the last human alive was almost too much to bear, but he forced himself to focus on the task at hand. He couldn't afford to dwell on what might have been. He had to keep moving forward to find out if there were others like him out there. With his backpack fully loaded, Ricky made his way back to the control center. The map was still displayed on the holographic table, showing the location of the other cryo facility to the east. It was a long journey, and he would need to travel on foot, but he was determined to make it. AI, can you provide me with the safest route to the other facility? Ricky asked, studying the map closely. The AI processed his request for a moment before highlighting a path on the map. This route will take you through the least hazardous areas, it explained. However, you should still be cautious. The terrain is rough, and there may be unexpected dangers along the way. Ricky nodded, memorizing the route. He was as prepared as he could be, given the circumstances. It was time to leave the safety of the facility and face whatever awaited him in the world outside. "Thank you," Ricky said, his voice tinged with a mix of gratitude and apprehension. "I'll be back." The AI didn't respond, but Ricky didn't expect it to. With one last look around the control center, he steeled himself and made his way to the facility's main entrance. The large metal doors were heavy, and it took all of his strength to pull them open. A blast of cold air hit him as the doors creaked apart, the outside world finally revealed. What Ricky saw took his breath away. The landscape before him was barren and desolate, a frozen wasteland stretching as far as the eye could see. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with clouds that threatened snow, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of ice and snow. Twisted, skeletal remains of trees jutted out from the ground like the bones of some long-dead beast, and the wind howled mournfully through the empty landscape. The AI had mentioned catastrophic events, but it had given no details. Ricky's mind raced with possibilities: natural disasters, war, disease, perhaps even something beyond human understanding. But without more information, all he could do was speculate. The journey was monotonous, the landscape offering little variation as he trudged through the snow. Occasionally, Ricky would come across the remnants of human civilization, rusted metal structures half buried in the snow, broken pieces of machinery, and even the occasional skeletal remains of some long-dead creature. These remnants served as grim reminders of the world that had once been, and the people who had lived and died in it. As the day wore on, the sky began to darken once again, signaling the approach of another cold, unforgiving night. Ricky knew he needed to find shelter, but the barren landscape offered few options. He pushed himself to keep moving, hoping to find some form of cover before the temperature dropped too low. Just as the last light of day began to fade, Ricky spotted a structure in the distance. It was a large, dome-shaped building, partially collapsed and covered in snow, but it was the first sign of human habitation he had seen since leaving the cryo facility. With renewed energy, Ricky quickened his pace, heading toward the structure. As he drew closer, Ricky could see that the building had once been some sort of outpost, though it was now in a state of severe disrepair. The metal walls were rusted and corroded, and parts of the roof had caved in, leaving gaping holes through which snow had drifted inside. Despite its condition, it would provide better shelter than the portable tent, and Ricky decided to take his chances. He carefully made his way inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior was in worse shape than the exterior, with debris scattered across the floor and icicles hanging from the ceiling. Ricky navigated through the wreckage, searching for a relatively safe spot to set up camp. In one corner of the outpost, Ricky found a small, intact room that had escaped the worst of the damage. The door was still functional, and the walls provided some insulation against the cold. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Ricky set up his sleeping bag on the floor and sat down, grateful for the small measure of protection the room provided. As he settled in for the night, Ricky's thoughts turned once again to the other cryo facility. He was getting closer, but the journey had taken its toll on him, both physically and mentally. The isolation, the harsh conditions, and the constant uncertainty were wearing him down. But he refused to give up. There was still hope that he might find others, that he might not be the last human alive. Ricky closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling him towards sleep. But even as he drifted off, his mind was filled with questions. What would he find at the other facility? Would there be other survivors, or would he find only more death and decay? And what would happen if he truly was the last human left? The night passed in restless slumber, haunted by dreams of the past and fears of the future. When Ricky awoke the next morning, the sky outside was as gray and bleak as ever, but he felt a renewed sense of determination. He packed up his gear and stepped outside, ready to continue the journey. The path ahead was difficult, but Ricky was no stranger to hardship. He had faced impossible odds before, and he would face them again. As he set off toward the mountains, he felt a spark of hope burning in his chest, a small but powerful flame that drove him forward. The mountain pass. The mountains loomed larger with each passing hour, their jagged peaks cutting into the sky like the teeth of some ancient beast. The air grew colder as Ricky approached, and the wind picked up, whipping through the narrow valleys with a bone-chilling ferocity. The journey had been grueling so far, but he knew that the real challenge was just beginning. The path to the other cryo facility led through the heart of the mountain range, a treacherous route that would test his endurance and resolve. The AI's map had shown several possible passes through the mountains, but it was impossible to know which one would be the safest. Ricky would have to rely on his instincts and hope that he chose the right path. As he began the ascent, Ricky's progress slowed to a crawl. The snow was deep and uneven, making it difficult to find stable footing. The radiation suit and thermal clothing provided some protection against the cold, but the higher altitude brought with it new challenges. The air was thin, and each breath felt like a struggle, his lungs burning with the effort. The terrain was rugged and unforgiving, with steep cliffs and narrow ledges that required careful navigation. Ricky's hands and feet were numb from the cold, and he had to stop frequently to catch his breath and regain his strength. The thought of turning back crossed his mind more than once, but he pushed it aside, driven by the knowledge that he had come too far to give up now. Hours passed as Ricky slowly made his way through the mountain pass. The wind howled around him, carrying with it the scent of snow and ice. The cold was relentless, sapping his energy and making every movement a battle against his own body. But Ricky was determined to reach the other side, to find out if there were others like him still alive. As the day wore on, the light began to fade, casting long shadows across the mountainside. Ricky knew that he needed to find shelter soon, but the steep cliffs and rocky terrain offered little in the way of protection. He scanned the area, searching for anything that might provide cover from the elements. Finally, he spotted a small cave tucked into the side of the mountain, its entrance partially obscured by snow and ice. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Ricky made his way toward the cave, his legs trembling with exhaustion. When he reached the entrance, he hesitated for a moment, peering into the darkness. The cave was narrow and low, barely large enough to accommodate him and his gear, but it was better than spending the night exposed on the mountainside. Ricky crawled inside, grateful for the brief respite from the wind. The cave was colder than he had hoped, the walls covered in a thin layer of frost, but at least it provided some shelter from the elements. He quickly set up his sleeping bag and huddled inside, trying to conserve as much body heat as possible. As he lay there, Ricky's thoughts drifted to the other cryo facility. He was getting closer, but the journey had taken a toll on him. The harsh conditions, the isolation, and the constant struggle for survival had worn him down, but he refused to give up. He had made a promise to himself to see this through, no matter what it took. The wind howled outside the cave, a mournful sound that echoed through the mountains. Ricky pulled the sleeping bag tighter around himself, trying to block out the noise. He knew that he needed to rest, to gather his strength for the final leg of the journey. But sleep was elusive. His mind was filled with thoughts of what he might find at the other facility, whether there would be other survivors or whether he would find only more death and decay. The hours dragged on, and eventually exhaustion overtook him. Ricky fell into a fitful sleep, his dreams haunted by images of a world long gone. He saw the earth as it had been, vibrant and full of life, only to watch it crumble into dust before his eyes. He heard the voices of those he had lost, calling out to him from the darkness, but when he reached for them, they slipped away like smoke. When Ricky awoke, it was still dark outside, the sky heavy with the promise of more snow. He forced himself to sit up, his body stiff and sore from the cold. Every muscle ached, and his head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain, but he couldn't afford to linger. He needed to keep moving to reach the other facility before the weather turned even worse. Ricky packed up his gear and crawled out of the cave, shivering as the cold air hit him. The wind had died down somewhat, but the temperature had dropped even lower, and the snow crunched underfoot as he resumed his journey. The mountains were shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon as it peeked through the clouds. As he continued the climb, the path grew steeper and more treacherous. The rocks were slick with ice, and the ledges narrowed to the point where one misstep could send him plummeting into the abyss below. Ricky moved with extreme caution, his hands gripping the rock face as he carefully made his way forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ricky reached the highest point of the pass. From here, he could see the other side of the mountain range, a vast expanse of snow-covered plains stretching out before him. The sight filled him with a sense of relief, but also a renewed sense of urgency. He was close now, just a few more miles, and he would reach the other facility. The descent was just as difficult as the ascent, if not more so. The steep slope was covered in loose rocks and snow, making it easy to lose his footing. Ricky's legs burned with the effort, and his breaths came in ragged gasps, but he kept moving, driven by the knowledge that he was almost there. As he neared the base of the mountain, the light began to return, the first rays of dawn breaking through the clouds. Ricky paused for a moment, taking in the sight of the sun rising over the mountains. It was a beautiful, haunting scene, the light reflecting off the snow and ice, casting everything in a soft, ethereal glow. For a brief moment, Ricky felt a sense of peace, a connection to the world that had once been. But the moment was fleeting. Ricky knew that he couldn't afford to linger. The other cryo facility was just ahead, and he needed to reach it before the weather turned. With renewed determination, he continued down the mountain, his pace quickening as the terrain leveled out. Finally, after hours of trudging through the snow, Ricky spotted the facility in the distance. It was a large, squat building, similar in design to the one he had left, though it appeared to be in better condition. The sight filled him with hope, and he quickened his pace, eager to reach the facility and find out if there were any survivors. As he approached the entrance, Ricky noticed that the doors were slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out into the snow. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped inside, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The interior of the facility was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of machinery. Ricky made his way through the corridors, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The layout of the facility was almost identical to the one he had left, and he quickly found his way to the control center. The room was filled with monitors and control panels, all of them operational, though the screens were covered in a thick layer of dust. As he approached the main console, Ricky hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the controls. He knew that whatever he found here could change everything, either giving him hope or confirming his worst fears. Taking a deep breath, he activated the console, the screens flickering to life. The AI's voice crackled through the speakers, its tone calm and detached. "Welcome to Cryo Facility Alpha 3. Please state your identification and purpose." Ricky quickly inputted his credentials, and the AI processed the information. There was a brief pause, and then the AI responded. Identification confirmed. Cryo Unit Ricky Bell, last active on March 15, 5002 AD. What is your request? Ricky's heart pounded in his chest as he asked the question that had been burning in his mind since he left the other facility. Are there any other survivors? The AI took a moment to process the request before responding. Scanning. There are 5 active cryo units in this facility. All units are currently in hibernation. Would you like to initiate the wake-up sequence? Ricky's breath caught in his throat. There were others, 5 other people who had survived the long centuries of cryo-sleep. He wasn't alone. Yes, Ricky replied, his voice trembling with emotion. Initiate the wake-up sequence. The AI acknowledged the command, and Ricky watched as the monitors displayed the status of the 5 cryo units. One by one, the units began to power up, the hibernation process slowly reversing. Ricky felt a surge of hope, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to fully embrace until now.